Hello, my name is Tori Thomas, a researcher with the Houston Education Research Consortium, also known as HERC, which is also part of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. Today, I will be discussing findings from HERC's ongoing career technical education, also known as CTE study. In particular, I will be sharing results about workforce and college outcomes among CTE graduates in the state of Texas. Today, I will present part 4 of a 5-part series exploring the short and longer-term workforce and college outcomes for CTE graduates in Texas. Before jumping into the findings, I want to share the background on our research questions and data. Today's presentation addresses 3 research questions. We examine each of these 3 questions at 2 time points: 3 years after high school graduation, which is enough time for one to complete a 2-year degree, and 6 years after high school graduation, enough time for one to complete a 2-year degree and or a 4-year degree. The first main research question examines the relationship between CTE status and 1, year-round work status, and 2, earnings at the 2 time points, as well as whether either of these relationships vary by associate or bachelor's degree status. The second research question particularly focuses on whether the likelihood of working year-round or earnings vary among CTE career clusters among CTE graduates. The third research question focuses on whether earnings among both CTE and non-CTE graduates vary by the industry they work in. As a reminder, based on graduate CTE engagement during high school, we have grouped them into 2 broad categories: CTE graduates and non-CTE graduates. CTE grads are those who had the most CTE engagement during high school, either completing or concentrating in one career cluster, while non-CTE grads had less engagement with CTE as a whole or with a single career cluster. As mentioned in the previous presentation, about 2/3 of graduates in the state of Texas are classified as CTE graduates. So most graduates in Texas meaningfully engage with CTE during high school. We utilize several different data sources for analyses, including Texas Education Agency Teams data, Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board college enrollment and graduation data, National Student Clearinghouse enrollment data, and Texas Workforce Commission employment and wage data. Our data allows us to look at distinct groups of students depending on how far post-high school we are interested in. As indicated by the gold boxes, we have 3-year data for 5 graduating cohorts. As indicated by the blue boxes, we also have 6-year data for the 2014 and 2015 graduating cohorts. Now that you know more about our analyses and data, let's take a look at our key findings. There are 2 main takeaways. Number 1, CTE grads were more likely to work year-round and earn more than non-CTE grads 3 years after high school graduation. This pattern held true among those with no degree, those still enrolled, and those with an associate's degree. This pattern also held true across CTE career cluster for CTE graduates and industry work. Number 2, CTE grads were slightly more likely to work year-round 6 years after high school graduation. However, CTE and non-CTE graduates make the same expected earnings by this time point. This pattern held true among those with no degree, those still enrolled, and those with any type of post-secondary degree. This pattern also held true across CTE career clusters for CTE graduates and industry work. Now that we've seen the main takeaways, let's take a deep dive into each of them. I will begin with workforce and earning outcomes 3 years post-high school graduation, followed by those same outcomes 6 years post-high school graduation. This slide displays percentages of those working year-round by CTE status 3 years post-high school graduation. As displayed, CTE grads were slightly more likely to work year-round than non-CTE graduates. Particularly among CTE grads, 46% work year-round 3 years after graduating high school, whereas 41% of non-CTE grads worked year-round at that same time point. This graph shows the proportion of graduates working year-round by CTE status, further broken down by associate's degree status, not enrolled and not with a degree, still enrolled in college, and an associate's degree. As you can see here, when we break this out by degree status at year 3, CTE grads, the orange bars, were more likely to work year-round than non-CTE grads, the blue bars. Furthermore, among CTE grads, among the orange bars, those with an associate's degree were the most likely to be working year-round at year 3, compared to those not enrolled in college and those still enrolled in college. This graph presents expected earnings of those working year-round 3 years after high school graduation, broken down by CTE status and associate's degree status. In addition to who are more likely to work, again you can see in the orange bars that CTE grads have slightly higher expected earnings than non-CTE grads, shown in the blue bars, across associate degree and college enrollment status. However, note that those with an associate's degree had higher expected earnings than those still enrolled in a post-secondary program, but still lower than those who were not enrolled and had no degree. Because there were only slight differences in expected earnings between CTE grads and non-CTE grads, we discussed expected earnings of all graduates across industries by whether they were attending or completed an associate's degree. We show the top 5 industries where graduates were working at year 3 and the average for the remaining other industry categories. The dark gray dots depict expected earnings for graduates still attending college. The light gray dots represent those no longer attending college and who did not have a degree. And lastly, the orange dots represent graduates who had attained an associate's degree. Even across industries work, we see that CTE and non-CTE grads without a degree and not enrolled in college had higher expected earnings 3 years after high school graduation than graduates with an associate's degree or still in college. A possible explanation for this finding is that perhaps those with no degree / not enrolled are making more because they focus on working since finishing high school, whereas those who are still enrolled and those with associate's degrees had less time to engage in work within those 3 years after graduating high school. After examining the same outcomes among CTE students 3 years post-high school graduation, we found that the likelihood of working year-round or having higher earnings did not vary by CTE career cluster, even when degree status and industry work were taken into consideration. Now I turn to present findings for the same outcomes, but this time 6 years after high school graduation. This slide displays percentages of those working year-round by CTE status by this time point. Like the findings on the previous time point, CTE grads were still slightly more likely to work year-round than non-CTE grads 6 years after high school graduation. Particularly among CTE grads, 51% worked year-round 6 years after graduating high school, whereas 46% of those non-CTE grads worked year-round at that same time point. Like the graph for the previous time point, the graph shows the proportion of graduates working year-round by CTE status further broken down by degree attainment status. Not enrolled, no degree; still enrolled in college, associate's degree, and bachelor's degree. In examining the relationship between CTE status and working year-round further broken down by degree attainment status, the pattern from the previous time point held true for this time point. CTE graduates, indicated by the orange bars, were more likely than non-CTE grads, the blue bars, to have a year-round work 6 years after graduating high school. This pattern was especially true among those with associate's degrees and bachelor's degrees. Like the graph for the previous time point, this graph shows that expected earnings among those working year-round 6 years after high school graduation by CTE status, further broken down by degree attainment status. Even though CTE grads with degrees were most likely to work year-round, CTE and non-CTE grads have similar expected earnings 6 years after graduating high school. Regardless of whether one is a CTE grad or not, those with bachelor's degrees have the highest expected earnings relative to those of all other degree attainment groups. Because there are no meaningful differences in expected earnings between CTE grads and non-CTE grads at this time point, we discussed expected earnings of all graduates across industries by whether they were attending college, completed an associate's degree, or completed a bachelor's degree. We show the top 5 industries where graduates are working at year 6 and the average for the remaining other industry categories. The dark gray dots depict expected earnings for graduates still attending college. The light gray dots represent those no longer attending college and they do not have a degree. The orange dots represent graduates who had attained an associate's degree, and the blue dots represent graduates who attained a bachelor's degree. Results show that whether one was a CTE graduate or not, having a bachelor's degree was related to expected earnings across industry work. Followed by those who worked in other industries, those in the health industry had the highest expected earnings. Similar to findings 3 years after high school graduation, findings also indicated that the likelihood of working year-round or having higher earnings 6 years after graduating high school did not vary by the CTE career cluster, considering degree status and industry work. Now, that was a lot of information, so let's recap our findings. Number 1, 3 years after graduating high school, CTE grads were slightly more likely to be working year-round and were earning more than non-CTE grads. Furthermore, this was true across associate degree status, CTE career clusters, and industry work. Number 2, 6 years after graduating high school, CTE grads were still slightly more likely than non-CTE grads to work year-round. However, differences in earnings that were present 3 years after high school graduation were no longer present at 6 years after high school graduation. Industry and degree attainment were more important factors for employment and earnings than CTE participation and CTE career cluster. CTE graduates have an advantage with work and earnings 3 years post-high school graduation, but this advantage decreases over time. By year 6, there are no meaningful differences between CTE status or by CTE career cluster when it comes to earnings. Having a bachelor's degree matters more for earning 6 years post-high school graduation. As mentioned, this presentation was part 4 of a 5-part series examining the post-secondary trajectories of CTE graduates. The next presentation will be shared in the coming weeks. Thank you so much for listening, and please don't hesitate to reach out with your questions and comments.